Hello, I am Omar Rivera. I am the chair of the Race and Ethnicity minor here at Southwestern. I'm also an assistant professor of philosophy. I am delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Nicole Guidoti Hernandez. Before I read out loud not all, but a selection of the things she's accomplished, when I learned that I was introducing her, I started looking into her research, and then I realized, and this is in the moment in which we're trying to kind of like rethink the Latin American Studies curriculum and make it more pertinent to us. And she really models the kind of research that I think our students should aspire to be doing. And so I think it's very appropriate to have her with us today. And if you're students and if you're going to listen carefully to what she's doing, I think you should think of Latin American Studies as a place where this kind of research can happen. Can you hear me at the back? Dr. Nicole Guidoti Hernandez is Associate Professor of American Studies, Chair of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies, and Associate Director of the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. She's an expert in borderlands history, transnational feminist methodologies, Chicano and Latino studies, and critical race studies, and all kinds of other things that I cannot end enumerating. Her book titled Unspeakable Violence, Remapping U.S. and Mexico National Imaginaries, published by Duke University Press in 2011, was a finalist for a 2012 Berkshire Women's History First Book Prize. She has published numerous articles in journals such as Women's Studies, International Forum, Social Text, the Latin Americanist and Latino Studies, where her article, Dora the Explorer, Constructing Latinidades and the Politics of Global Citizenship, is one of the most downloaded articles in the history of the journal. She's currently at work on 2 book-length projects. The first, Queering Borderlands Masculinities, examines 3 case studies about Mexican revolutionary Enrique Flores Magon's emotional life in exile, photo documentation of the homoerotics of abjection through the Bracero program in the Salinas Valley, and actor Danny Trejo's Body as Archive, to argue that a queer reading shows the unintended consequences of how nations, individuals, photographers, and communities depicted such masculinized bodies as the pathological limits of gender normativity. The second book is tentatively titled A Tale of Two Sisters, the Santa Cruz Family in the Making of Race, Gender, and Capitalism in the Transnational 19th Century U.S.-Mexico Borderlands. In it, she traces the ascent and descent of 3 generations of Tucsonense Mexica indigenous women's movement along the capitalist and racial spectrum from 1836 to 1950. The 2 sisters named in the title, Atanasia Santa Cruz de Hughes and Petra Santa Cruz Stevens, Spanish and Pima Indian Mexican, served as community brokers of social and capitalist relations in the transformation from Mexican to US territory for the Tucson Pueblo between 1850 and 1910. Her talk today is based on this book. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Omar. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And I want to say thank you and congratulations to Santiago, because he is proof that the portfolio program in Mexican American Latino Studies is highly successful in training cutting-edge researchers and scholars. And your other professor, Professora Brenda Zendejo, is another perfect example of the kind of intense and competitive graduate training you can receive at the University of Texas at Austin with us. And so I'm hoping that you will come and talk to me afterwards, the young people, or those seeking a second PhD, perhaps, to talk to me about the wonderful offerings that we have at UT Austin. Please know that there's an open door for you. I also want to thank Patrick, Omar, and Eric for inviting me here today. It's a real honor to be giving this lecture. And I'm going to be old school in the sense that I'm going to be talking about the 19th century and women in fancy dresses. And I'm going to be old school in that I have a paper. So please bear with me. I hope that you enjoy the narrative and what I think it has to say about the history of capitalism in the American Southwest. So this woman right here is Petra Santa Cruz Hughes. When her husband tried to kill her before taking her own life on March 24th of his own life on March 24th of 1893, in the Tucson, Arizona territory, Petra Santa Cruz Stevens, who was 50 years old at the time, was saved from death by her peñeta, that is, a hair clip made of metal. A symbol of propriety and Spanishness, this link to Tucson's Spanish colonial past deflected the bullet so that it did not penetrate her skull in its entirety. Often a symbol of mourning and modesty in traditional Spanish Catholic practices, the peñeta is ceremonial and worn during weddings, processions, dances, and other important moments in life. Popularized by Queen Isabella of Spain and used with a mantilla, the peñeta that Santa Cruz Stevens had in her hair that day that she was almost killed was a way of signifying her upper-class status, a claim to Spanishness, perhaps a distancing from indigeneity, and more importantly, it was the difference between her survival and her death. Make sure I get this right. Scholars know very little of Petra Santa Cruz Stevens in the historical record beyond this strange and somewhat sensational story. Her sister, Antanasia Santa Cruz de Hughes, was one of the most often cited Tucsonense Mexican women from the territorial era history of Arizona. Her sister was married to Sam Hughes, the founder of Tucson's first public school and organizer of the Cat Grant Indian Massacre, where 130 Aravaipa and Pinal Apache. And I talk more extensively about the women's role in the mobilization of that massacre in my first book. Petra's sister, Antanasia, was so important to Tucson history that her testimonies about the transformation of Mexican to U.S. territory become the basis and the primary source material really for all history of that era. What's interesting is Petra, who you saw in that first image, is often referred to as Antanasia's sister or the person that was married to her husband, Congressman Hiram Stevens. Petra is merely a wife and an appendage to history. But I think this has something to do with that murder-suicide attempt on that fateful day of March 23rd, 1893. What we also need to know about the moment of that suicide and that murder attempt is it is directly linked with the financial panic of 1893. For those of you that don't know what happened with the financial panic of 1893, Barron Brothers Bank in Argentina failed, which then created a run on U.S. gold and investments where many investors here in the U.S. cashed out, making many banks fail. I'd like to have us think about the attempted murder-suicide and Petra Santa Cruz Stevens' disappearance from history as a real link and set of evidence about the material effects of the economic crash in daily life. So my argument today is that the unsuccessful murder-suicide attempt by Hiram Stevens on his wife, Petra Santa Cruz Stevens, set into motion what we become a set of self-imposed historical invisibility, a historical invisibility that really is derived from the shame wrought by the 1893 market crash and the way that that 1893 market crash devalued the racial capital that her family had amassed. So the sum total of my readings today stage a series of interventions, for this is not a typical Borderlands history. I'd like to think about it as a reassessment of Borderlands history in the ways that it is currently practiced, often as a masculinized field of discourse. I'd also like us to think about the ways in which material objects and the effective social labor of producing legible subjects is indeed a part of doing women's history. And I'd also like us to think about the gendered and racial modalities that inform property relations. That is, what we own determines who we are. All of this is to say that I think a feminist critique through social history gives us a glimpse at how something as simple or as grandiose as a murder-suicide attempt can get us to think differently about the role of gender, of capitalism, and sexuality in the larger history of the US-Mexico borderlands. So first, what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of history about the family. And so you can see these are the movers and shakers of Tucson Mexicano Anglo history from roughly about 1850 to 1900. And I will get into the images more discreetly in a minute. So the Santa Cruz women who you see here start their ascent out of poverty when Petra, on the far left, met her husband, Hiram Stevens, at the age of 13. Stevens had immediately started courting her, but her aunt did not like him because, as she says, quote, he wasn't even Catholic, end quote, which, you know, in the 1850s was a real problem. 3 years later, Stevens found a priest to baptize him so that he could marry Petra, also very smart, right? And in roughly 1859, at the age of 16, she married Hiram Stevens, who was 11 years her senior. Marriages like the Stevens-Santa Cruz Union were quite common during this period. And while there were no anti-miscegenation laws on the books in Arizona at this time, there was a way in which such Mexican Anglo unions signaled a crossing of different cultural and religious tenets. Unlike California, where Anglo men often married into California families to have access to Spanish land grants, their Arizona counterparts had already had those land grants significantly broken up. And in Tucson in the 1850s, what integrated American newcomers into society was not access to land through intermarriage, but access to cultural capital and the domestication of these men by becoming Mexicanized to some degree. In essence, Tucsonense Mexican women, like the ones that you're seeing in this picture, aided in Anglo ascendancy in territorial Arizona through intermarriage and through the sharing of culture. They actively configured a racial image of the Pueblo's Spanish-speaking population by emphasizing their Spanish heritage at the same time that they were married to Anglo men. And they became part of and shaped what I like to think about and what they really talk about as an emerging white hegemony. And this, however, changed with the arrival of the railroads in the 1870s and the increased emigration of white women. And so while ideas about race and interracial marriage were somewhat flexible for these Mexican daughters of those who settled the Tucson Presidio because they claimed whiteness and Spanish ancestry, the question of skin color was still tenuous and anxiety-causing because brownness was linked to indigeneity. And if you know anything about the state of Arizona, there was, you know, a 150-year-plus conflict with the Apaches and with the Yaquis, well up into the 1930s, that sort of sets the tone for why this question of race is so tenuous. And so those wars, even with the surrender of Geronimo's men in the 1890s, supposedly signaling the end of border warfare, these ideas and ideologies really colored race relations in southern Arizona. So much so that being a Mexican mistaken for an Indian had many consequences. And thus the only way to achieve racial, social, and cultural distinction was to police the racial boundaries and claim the rights of citizenship by defending small-scale private property. That is, really participating in Victorian ideas and ideologies of wealth and capitalist accumulation. So one of the things that I just want to point out about this photograph, which I think it's a magnificent piece of evidence, is really the excess that we see in this photograph, and I'm going to talk more extensively about that. What do I mean by excess? Look at the excess fabric. Look at the jewelry. Look at the detail of the cuffs on the dresses and the sheen of the fabric, that silk, the leather of the jacket that Antanasia is wearing over her calico dress, the small ruffle detail on the bottom. For me, this is very telling about how material excess and the materiality of wealth plays out very explicitly through fashion and through the details of really what is capitalist accumulation. So I think this is yes, it's a beautiful picture, but it also really gives us an idea of the way that people were performing their wealth, right, as a means of social mobility. So what I also want to talk about is the ways in which these images do ideological work. This particular photo, I think, as the previous one, sort of gives us a way to think about that small-scale property ownership, both in terms of land, but also in terms of material goods. through family records. And studio portraits like this one by Washington, D.C. photographers and the Bowman Studio from Territorial, Arizona, document the ways in which Petra Santa Cruz Stevens iconographically distanced themselves from the lower classes and indigenous peoples through property ownership, proximity to governance, and self-possession. In this photo that you see here, and the previous one, Petra and her sister were well-dressed in silks and taffeta, large quantities of them, no small expense in the 1850s, where such fabrics took several days to travel by wagon from Mexico City or from the eastern United States into the territory. What we notice in both pictures is that the women engage the camera with humility, but also demonstrate their difference through that humility. Their husbands almost more explicitly engage the camera. And one of the things that we can also glean from this picture is that even though it's sepia-toned, we can tell that there are indeed differences in skin color, which again, I think, get us to that question about how racial categories are not fixed, but rather socially constructed. The other thing that these images do is they represent an emergent class of merchants documenting their rise into affluence. And as scholar Nicole Hudgens has argued, 19th century portraiture was a means of building a visual sense of one's own past, and I would argue a future, including women's ability to exert their subjectivity by capturing it on film. And while standards of neatness and elegance perhaps optimize the photographer's results, the conventions about quality, about propriety, about excess, and about goods all sort of show us racial capital in action, right? That is, how racialized subjects can advance through society through their accoutrement, right? Through their dress, through their stylization, through their self-representation. But one of the other things that we need to know about this picture is that it was taken when Stevens was serving in the US Congress. In fact, he was one of the first territorial delegates to the US Congress. And for me, it really gives us a sense about a national perspective on family, a symbolic representation of the national family through Congress. I was just on a plane with Ted Cruz 2 days ago, and so I survived. And I think that, there is this very clear sense that our elected officials and their families really become emblematic of that nation-building project. And so I would say that just like Senator Cruz, who I was on the plane with the other day, right here too, we see a very particular kind of stylization that is about representing the nation and national family. So the symbolic work of these photos of congressional members and their families were a means of fomenting the idea of a strong nation. They also convey family values and the opulence of class status. And while we look at Petra's gaze slightly to the left, if we look really closely, we can see her chandelier earrings and her 4 rings, 2 on one hand and 2 on another, coupled with Stevens' ring and shiny pocket watch, which all, again, highlight the accumulation of wealth. These signifiers of petit bourgeois property ownership reproduce Victorian excess as economic and white racial normativity. And in an oral history, Petra's daughter Elisa reminisced that Hiram, her father, quote, loved to dress Petra up and buy jewelry for her. Petra was successful at the nation's capital. She was pretty but could not speak a word of English, end quote. So while Elisa, Petra's daughter, describes her mother as a kind of wonderful and fashionable appendage, there's something else we need to think about, which is Petra's lack of acumen with English. And I think this is part of the reason why she sort of becomes this marginal figure in history as well. The fact that she is sort of seen and not heard, perhaps infantilizes Petra, and the physical description by her daughter is no exception. And here, as with the previous picture, we see that Petra is much lighter colored skin color than her sister, and if one did not know, perhaps she could have passed for white, except as her daughter tells us, she didn't speak English very well. In some ways, I think this complete picture of the petit bourgeois family conceals racial difference, or at least attempts to, I don't know how successfully, by putting the focus on wealth, material excess, and the idea of family as a solitary unit displayed in market value. It also directly evokes the history of US imperialism, which facilitated such interracial unions, their visibility, and their acceptability from the 1850s to the 1880s. So this Victorian accumulation of wealth and opulence, though, I think diverts our attention away from the trials and tribulations of 19th century family life, which was determined by struggle and stresses for both sexes, such as competition, childhood illness, death, and other forms of disease. So in these pictures, while we cannot see Petra's dislike for the East because she is indeed performing nation and belonging, there was a sense that emerged from her diaries that she was unhappy when she was in Washington, D.C. with her husband when he served in Congress between 1874 and 1878. Petra soon had grown tired of social life in Washington, D.C. and returned home to her family, most likely out of that cultural and linguistic isolation that her daughter had mentioned. Thus, despite the benefits and social privileges of becoming an overly legible subject to the U.S. nation-state as the wife of a congressman, Petra's close-knit ties to her Tucson family and linguistic limitations outweighed those of her obligation to be the good wife. Thus, she returned to Tucson during the second half of her husband's first term. The other thing that we should know as readers is that Stevens was really busy when he was in Congress. In addition to trying to advocate for the removal of the Apaches from Arizona, he had an affair. He had an affair with a woman named Clara L. Knight, and she bore a daughter named Clara Jane Knight Stevens on June 20th of 1880. Stevens didn't legally or publicly admit that he was the father of his child, but he did give her his name, deed property to her, and open a bank account in her name. That Stevens had a child from this affair, no doubt, had a number of traumatic and shameful effects on Petra Stevens and her larger family, and in several of the diaries, the family talk about the very wounding nature of the discovery of the affair and the illegitimate child. In the larger context of Tucsonense and Mexican Catholic women's circles, public infidelity was one of the biggest insults against the sacrament of marriage. And the fact that it was with a woman who came from the same dominant cultural group from her husband could not have made it any easier. But despite these normative capitalist citizenship that's tethered to whiteness as property displayed in the pictures, the illegitimate child magnified Petra's difference on many fronts. The affair also marked Stevens' alienation from his culturally and racially different wife. But the other thing that the birth of Clara Jane Knight Stevens confirms is that Petra in this union was infertile, and they adopted children later. And it was also a topic of shame and reflection in this family's history, in their private papers and in their documents. And in the context of shame and responsibility in Catholic conceptions of womanhood generated through Marianismo and other ideologies, women like Petra could not biologically fulfill this motherly duty or the notion of Republican motherhood, which I think became very acute given the fact that she was indeed married to a congressman. Instead, Stevens' mistress produced the heir to the family legacy, creating deep social anxiety about race, capitalism, inheritance, and legacy. So one of the things that I think leads up to this, or rather characterizes this life of scandal, is that Stevens is, he's very wealthy, he circulates, right, he's a congressman. Petra and he are married, and they become some of the richest people in the Arizona territory. And so they're used to living this really kind of privileged life, right? Their friends would have parties to entertain Army officers. General Grant came to their home. They had a peacock in their parlor, right? I mean, really kind of excessive versions of wealth. And I almost think that Petra, became very used to it by looking at the documents and sort of seeing the materiality and the evidence of their wealth. And so I think that's why the financial panic of 1893 and the murder-suicide become such a shocking horror, not just for this family, but for the community at large. So let me move on here, which is this. During the early 1890s, as I mentioned, the financial panic led to crashing prices of real estate and bank failures. They reflected a too quickly expanding modernity brought to the region by the arrival and rapid expansion of the railroad. This, in addition to overgrazing, prolonged drought, failing businesses, and an economic recession, took men and women like Petra and Hiram Stevens from being the richest in the territory to what they might have considered dire poverty. The arrival of the railroad and the end of the Indian Wars, in theory, should have stimulated the local economy because it opened the space up for goods to pass through the territory unfettered. However, Arizona's once booming economy was no longer controlled by local merchants, and instead by the Union Pacific Railroad and Southern Pacific of Mexico, in addition to foreign investors and speculators, which were responsible for moving goods and doing trade transactions across national boundaries and in the locality of the territory. What I think we need to think about in terms of how this economic crash bared on their daily lives is the fact that this was a speculative modernity. It was a modernity wrought by capitalist speculation, and it had a human cost, and that Stevens and his family were not particularly prepared for this new phase of speculative capitalism. For example, he had an investment as the sole owner of the Gas Light Company, founded in the 1880s, which provides a concrete example of speculation got wrong because the city decided to switch to electric power in 1893, rendering his stock worthless at the time of his death. Stevens also liquidated his holdings in the Cosmopolitan Hotel, known to be the finest hotel in the territory, for $2,800, which was less than half of what it was worth on March 11th of 1893. After selling this hotel, he then sent $400 to his 12-year-old daughter, Clara Jane Knight Stevens, in Washington, D.C., and deposited the remainder of the money in her account. 2 days after that Gas Light Company went under, and 2 days after he sold the Cosmopolitan Hotel, Hughes and Stevens and Company, his other business, was deep in debt, shut its doors, and seized by creditors. And on the day before his death, Stevens was described as being despondent upon his return to town because large numbers of his cattle had been found dead along the road to Nogales. Some accounts say that he shot the cattle that were not already dead. But nonetheless, distraught by sudden economic changes, the former congressman and Indian fighter on that fateful night of March 24th of 1893 shot his wife twice and then turned the gun on himself. The first bullet hit Petra's Spanish peñeta, as I mentioned earlier. The second went through the fleshy part of her hand. He later used a second gun to shoot himself in the head, and Petra underwent an emergency operation to dislodge what many assumed was a bullet from her skull. And family history reveals, as I said before, that that peñeta is literally what kept her alive. As you see here, the headlines of the Arizona Daily Star and Tucson Daily Citizen announced this psychic break between self-invention and capitalist losses, really the economic and social bearings of that market crash of 1893. At 3 p.m. on the previous day, Stevens had returned from a Board of Supervisors meeting because he felt ill, and Petra, who was suffering from a headache, told him he was the more ill of the two and that he should lay down to rest. Stevens, in a kindly manner, passed his hand over her forehead, and the next thing that she knew, there was the report of a pistol, and she felt a burning sensation on her head. She screamed, "For God's sake, what are you doing?" End quote, where she then grabbed for the .44 caliber bulldog in Stevens' hand, and it went off again, this time the ball passing through her hand. He then hastily went for the .45 caliber Colt that was his favorite gun from his time in the Army and turned it upon himself. After that second shot was fired, the ball entered through the forehead above the right eye and exited out the top of his skull, tearing a ghastly hole in it. As the article says, Stevens was dead by his own hand, and, quote, he did it while his mind was temporarily unbalanced from intense pain. His actions of late are not those of the Stevens as his old friends know him. A lamentable affair, Mrs. Stevens' condition serious, end quote. What I think is interesting, and for us to draw in conclusions in terms of, the kind of historiographic content of this, is that we really get a clear sense of how the market, a non-human actor, affected daily life during this market crash of 1893. The psychic break and ill health was a product of untreated medical conditions that were exacerbated by the stress of market anxiety. Here we see the physical consequences of bad market futures manifesting in the body and in familial relations. When Stevens could no longer enforce his power through the privilege of his wealth, his world literally fell apart. A concrete rupture with the history of racialized capital, the murder-suicide mirrored the interruption of normal capitalist reproduction in the market. All of the accounts of this event suggest that while Stevens was not in his right mind, we have to pay attention to the fact that there is indeed a relationship between the market and economies of emotion. These narratives also magnify the fact that Petra was a casualty of that market speculation gone wrong. The outcome of monetary speculation led to her injury, led to her husband's death, led to her disappearance from the social world. It was her response to this violent tragedy. And when Petra Santa Cruz Stevens' account emerged in the press, all they spoke about was the fact that she too was connected to a rational frame of mind. And obviously, after experiencing a successful suicide attempt by your husband and being shot was no small trauma to face in light of this economic loss that they experienced in the marketplace. So these pain and loss were caused by a non-human actor. And yet, her husband took out those frustrations on his wife as a primary target of his suicidal violence. And one could argue that he wished to save her from the shame of his fall from economic grace and take her with him into death. One could also argue that he had a sense that he failed her and desired not to fail her anymore. Or one could argue that he blamed her for his economic losses. And while I've not been able to find evidence to suggest that these are indeed concrete facts, I still think that we need to pay attention to the idea that the market was the actor that initiated and instigated the cycle of violence in this household. So Petra essentially disappears after this murder-suicide attempt. Where does she go? What does she do? Luckily, I had access to her archives, which are at the Tucson Historical Society, right next door to the University of Arizona. It's actually Latin American Studies Institute. And what we see is that even though she didn't have a public life, she had a very active private life. What she did is she spent her time raising her adopted children. She spent a lot of time working with the Catholic Church. She put an altar in her home with a painting of La Inmaculada as the frontispiece of that altar. These activities, these historical records, and her will, right, that I will talk about in a minute, suggests that while she retreated from public life, she indeed led a full private life that was tied to religion, penance, and I think reckoning with the shame of the murder-suicide and that fall from economic grace. What it shows is Petra's attentiveness to her economic means and position in the market. She attempted to take care of her family's land, what was left of it, and take care of her children. And I think that all of these private activities of religion and of informal participation in the market situate her within an alternative gendered history of self-making and capitalism in the region. And so I want to talk about her will, because I think wills really tell us a lot about, the students are kind of looking a little blank, like why a will, right? Wills are really important because they tell us again about that relationship between material objects, what they mean to the person that's leaving them as inheritance, and what their relationship was to the market. So these are some of the things that she left that Petra felt were important to leave to other people in her family. So she left a piano, pillow shams, a homemade quilt, a Spanish silk shawl, the painting of Our Lady of the Immaculate, $50 to the Sisters of St. Mary, $50 to the Sisters of St. Joseph Orphanage, $126 to the parish priest at St. Augustine's Cathedral. I can only think that they probably had Sunday dinner together, that because she left that money to him, as some of my tias have done. Breast pins containing the picture of her late husband, Hiram Stevens, 2 silk shawls, and watch and shirt studs from her late husband, Mr. Hiram Stevens. And I apologize, there's a typo there. So why should we pay attention to this will? What does this will tell us? It tells us a lot. It tells us what Petra valued at the time of her death. It tells us what she held dear. It tells us of her emotional ties to her husband, even though he tried to kill her and he killed himself. So the first few items on the list, the piano and the pillow shams and the quilt, were left to her adopted daughter, Elisa. But what's interesting is that she was also left the silk shawl, but then Petra struck it out and amended the will about 7 days before she died, which tells us that her relationship with her daughter was probably not very good. Instead of giving that shawl to her daughter, she gave it to her friend Sarah Sanchez, and she willed her prized painting of Our Lady of the Immaculate to her friend Carmelita Romero. What is interesting about the next set of bequeathings, which are monetary amounts, is that they're given to charity, right? They're not given to her adopted daughter or her 5 children, right? They're given to charity. The Sisters of St. Mary, who founded the city's first hospital, the Sisters of St. Joseph, who ran an orphanage, and the parish priest, who was obviously part of her inner circle. And so if we think about that relationship between shame and penance and sort of the redemption of life after your partner commits suicide in a Catholic framework, it makes sense that she had this kind of proximity to these religious organizations and that she wanted to formally recognize them by handing over monetary donations, right, to them in her death. With that last set of donations, or rather bequeathings, excuse me, Petra pays debt to her family, but also to her husband's memory, right? These objects are tied to the man who tried to kill her, that breast pin with a picture of her husband, 2 silk shawls that she gives to her niece, and the shirt studs that she gives to her grandnephew, who is named after her husband. So, given the anguish of the murder-suicide attempt and the shame it brought to Petra Stevens, why would she hold on to these personal effects of her husband? Why would she hold on to them and memorialize them through the will? I think there are a few clues about this that we can take. We could argue that injury and that shame, especially because she's Catholic, right, structured her life, and that the uneven and traumatic nature of affect and memory coalesced through the willing of these objects. That is, in facing her own death, she too is reminded of her husband's death. But these bequeathings, I think, also represent the way that she cultivated a history of violence, the way that she lived with it intimately, and passed it on to her family in the willing of objects, producing affective relations of property. That is, there is a relationship between what we own and how we feel about it. So when we think about Petra's life through these material objects and their willing, it provides an emotional history, and it provides a history of violence. The will records the legacy of a woman who thought well enough of herself in life to make sure that her history was codified legally through the objects that she owned. And with this document, I believe, Petra gets the last word in writing herself into the juridical history of borderlands economies of exchange, 1 silk pillow sham, pocket watch, and painting of La Immaculada at a time. And so I want to just focus lastly on her obituary, which you see here at the bottom, aged Tucsonan, dies in California City. She has this really interesting life, right? She gets married at the age of 16 to one of the richest men in the Arizona territory. She's a Tucsonense Mexicana indigenous woman whose husband gets elected to Congress. She's got a clearly wealthy life, experiences the suicide and murder by the hands of her husband, right? And yet her obituary is these 3 tiny little paragraphs. And so I'd like to use this as a way to meditate on the history of property relations. This obituary from July 29th of 1919 seems to best unify the gendered and racialized modalities of property relations. This obituary is the closest possible thing to an idealized account of her life. A life that is so unremarked upon here for the various scandals involving her deceased husband that she perhaps, if this were truthful, would emerge as the most unideal kind of citizen possible. Even though we know from the evidence that I've presented today that she was a beacon of Catholic propriety and a reorder of racialized capitalist systems, she nonetheless had this family legacy to contend with, a legacy of suicide and violence that was both localized in their home, but also as the perpetrators and organizers of the Camp Grant Indian Massacre. I think one of the reasons why this obituary really just sort of descriptively talks about her, right? The deceased was born and reared in the vicinity. For many years, she watched the present city grow from one small village street. She had many acquaintances in the city in Pima County. I think it's so descriptive and bare and sparse precisely because the family wanted her to remain an ideal citizen in death. And so my sense is that what we need to think about with this vast history of Petra as the subject that rises to prominence through a capitalist system and then descends from prominence because of the market crash of 1893, we need to think about the fact that her life story provides a kind of complex narrative of the social, economic, and gendered and racial transformations that make up borderlands history. I think one woman's story can tell us much about how capitalism and national formation really did influence the way that the nation was constructed in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so while this obituary maintains her privacy and maintains the family's pioneer legacy, we need to think about why a history like this has much to say about what constituted proper Mexicana womanhood in the 19th century, what constituted upper-class propriety, or economic histories of violence and property relations in a place that existed on the margins of the nation-state. So for the young people, what does this tell us about racial capital in the contemporary period? The why should we care? Maybe the why I should wake up question, right? I think the relevance is that what it tells us is the subjects that emerge from Latino, Chicano, Latin American history, they're not always subaltern. Oftentimes they are figures of the upper class. Oftentimes they are figures emulating whiteness. We have this great conversation about millennials happening in the nation as the racial middle. I'd like to think about Petra Santa Cruz Stevens and her upper class peers as perhaps setting the stage of how millennials, Latino millennials, are talking about themselves as the racial middle. And so thus, I think what the story does for us is it tells us about how a market crash and mass social and political and personal upheaval was wrought by the market. It was wrought by the economy. It was wrought by speculation, and tells us about how the American Southwest history is as much a history of conquest as it is a history about the broadening and deepening of capitalism that did not affect white patriarchs or Tucsonense Mexicana women equally. In fact, we see from this history the way that capitalism touches all of us is very distinct in its processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. While they make their way up here, let me make a couple quick comments if I can. First, I want to highlight Patrick and Omar's role and my colleagues on the committee role in making all this happen and putting it together. And I'd like to ask you to give them a round of applause, please. Secondly, I have to tell you that this has really been an exceptional opportunity for me. 24 years ago, I interviewed for the job here to be the first of what was over a period of 10 years of a set of Latin Americanists that Southwestern hired with the idea of building a Latin American Studies program. And when I tell you it has been a process, it has been a process. But my colleagues are make it a real treat, and it's delightful to be part of this. Finally, our speakers of the last 2 days, I think, have presented us with a really phenomenal array of things to talk about and to think about. I have learned a great deal, both in terms of breadth and depth, and it's a really exciting opportunity to have them be able to take some time here at the end to reflect a little bit on what they've said and talked about with each other, but also to answer your questions as well. So with that, I'd like to open it up to you all. I think there's a microphone, right, that we can. Do we have one for the audience? No, but anyway, we'll see if we can make this work. You guys, be loud. You're Southwestern. Come on. So questions, comments, concerns. Sam?
So my question is for what's her name? Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
For Nicole. So. How long did her husband serve in Congress?
He served in Congress for 4 years. At that time, they were two-year terms, and so because they were a territory, there were two representatives, and he was one, and there was another from the Phoenix area. The gentleman's name is escaping me. I believe the last name is Hayden. So he served for 4 years, and he was the first territorial delegate to Congress. So it was actually a big deal because territories didn't really have representation at that point.
Just like modern Puerto Rico.
Just like modern Puerto Rico, you got it. Symbolic representation without real power to make actual institutional change. Yeah,
It was a territory.
yeah.
Other questions? Comments or concerns? It's not like you all to be shy. There are enough of you out there I can start calling on, you realize. Sadie, Kevin, Carly, Kenny.
Can I ask something real quick?
Please,
About
Patrick.
those portraits, Nicole, and the positions, the men are always seated and the women standing. Are you reading anything out of that, or is that just a kind of traditional trope of portraiture? Or does it say something more about social positions or class or race?
Yeah, I mean, so most of the photography has the patriarch at the center seated and everyone organized around him in this period. So if anything, I'd say it's a very gendered convention that cuts across racial strata, and you see this in general congressional familial portraits more broadly, but you also see it as a convention in the Arizona territory, in the vast array of photographs. The studio that took a Bowman studio, people would come from Phoenix to have him, by wagon to have him take take photographs of them because he was such a good photographer. And so if you, even of Chinese American portraiture, sort of in the late 19th century, that also comes out of the Bowman studio in Tucson, the organization is the same with the male patriarch at the center and then the women organized around him. So.
The symbolic weight of that is ironic in a way to me because the male's seated and kind of inactive, whereas the
Right.
women are standing.
Right. Well, and I think that, if we want to take that reading further, we're really talking about, right, women's reproductive labor, right? If we want to really kind of take that reading all the way. My sense is that the organization of the family around the patriarch is about the reproductive labor that happens around that figure, whether it's child rearing, cleaning of homes, cooking. Even though I know that Petra had, and I didn't have time to put this in the talk, they had domesticated Apache servants in their home. And I say the word domesticated because the young women were child captives that were taken from the Camp Grant massacre and put into Tucsonense Mexican homes to civilize them through domestic labor, which is a story that we're all very, that those of us that know that history are familiar with, which is, the trade in indigenous children was really how elite Mexicans and whites in places like New Mexico and Arizona, sort of built their households.
Please.
Yeah. My question is for Professor Guidoti. At some point you say that they are trying, the two sisters are trying to mirror some kind of white behavior.
Uh-huh.
Can you give us some kind of example that expose that kind of facility that they are trying to implement?
Yeah, so there's one really concrete moment where the two sisters are at a dance in 1862, and I have two oral histories that corroborate the event. And an Apache woman, Luisa, attempts to go and dance in the square of, it's the Augustine Square where the church originally was, and then it gets moved, during the Tucson Fiesta days. And Petra confronts Luisa and says, "Get out of here, you're not supposed to dance here. We are the leading citizens of the community." And Luisa's response is, "I am a person too." And so there's this very clear racial bifurcation around the distancing of themselves because they are indigenous. They're part Pima Indian, right? Their mother is actually Tohono, but the family, they say Pima, and so I say Pima, even though that's not the way that particular group identifies. And so there's this very clear sense of, and in that event in particular, where the women mobilize their proximity to whiteness, even though it's not exact whiteness, it's a proximity to whiteness as social capital. And all of the women use their Anglo names as a way to mobilize that capital. as well. Many of them drop the Santa Cruz or the Rivera right after there's a woman, Carolina Fitzhugh. Yeah, Carolina Rivera Fitzhugh, but she's Carolina Fitzhugh, right? And so there are these very concrete examples of the way that that racial move towards whiteness on the spectrum, and I'm using, Julie Dowling's word of the racial spectrum, right? And I know she was here, so I'm trying to get all my Southwestern references in today.
Well played.
Right, yeah. I think that there's a clear consciousness about that white racial spectrum, and while it's not whiteness per se, it's a proximity that's being achieved through kicking indigenous people out of social spaces or through the strategic use of Anglo last names. And then for indigenous women like Luisa, when she's interacting in the community with other Apache Manzos, which is how they refer to themselves, she insists that she be called Comadre and Luisa and be called Mrs. Handy, who she's married to. So there's also a way in which indigenous women are replicating the similar structure of incorporation and inclusion on this racial spectrum through the deploying of Anglified last names. So.
Wasn't that part of the Mexican history, though?
I think in part, but what I would say is that in Arizona, it's very acute because no one wants to be mistaken for an Apache. I would say that is the very specific kind of racial policing that happens in that area. I'm not saying it doesn't happen in other places, but it's a direct response to the proximity of the Pacheria and its activity into the 19 teens, right?
Carla?
My question was for Dr. Zamora. I was wondering today after Dr. Hernandez's lecture, I was thinking about how you mentioned in the curriculum the section on women and history of Mexican women in the U.S. and whether this made you think of any specific stories or any specific focuses within that curriculum.
Any specific stories regarding women? Is that what you mean?
What the focuses within that curriculum that focuses on women?
Okay. Well, I can tell you about one focus I've given women's history. I wrote a piece some years ago about Saracela Ramirez, who, there's all kinds of women, obviously, in all stations of life and with all kinds of ideas represented in their lives. But I was really attracted by this one woman who was associated with the Partido Liberal Mexicano, the Mexican Liberal Party that was exiled in this country, operated as an exile group. And one of the things that she demonstrates is that the women participate also in the leadership capacities. I think it's very important that children, the general public, understand that the Mexican-American community includes women that assume very prominent position in the communities in all kinds of spheres. She was particularly important in that exile politics. She was one of the first persons to basically sign on this side of the border with the Partido Liberal Mexicano before it even came here. And when it came in exile, they established their first headquarters at her home. She was also a poet, a journalist, and a teacher. And she contributed significantly in so many different ways. But I think for children, I think it's very important to focus on individuals, and through individuals, then teach a number of things, including the fact that women were also participants in this history and history making.
Can you give us some particular example for that individual that you are saying?
An example?
Examples of the individuals.
I have no doubt that Mexican-American women have some role. Can you give some particular example of why that woman is important for you?
Well, she was very important because I think, I believe that her life says a lot of things about her in particular, but through her, we can see a lot of things that are very important in the community. And one of the things among so many others that she allows us to see, is the importance that the Mexican community gives to teachers, profesoras.
Right, yeah, but I am focusing more in one particular fact that she did during her life that I think that is relevant, that she can characterize her as a leader in her community. One thing.
Well, she was one of the first ones to pronounce in favor of the Mexican Liberal Party through her newspaper. She also collaborated very closely with the women and the men in the leadership of the Exile group by publishing articles on the Mexican Liberal Party, by helping to raise funds, by assuming leadership positions along with the women when the men were imprisoned. There are many others. But what I was going to say is, I think a lot of times we ought to go beyond the individual and use the individual, in this case, Ramirez, to see what she tells us. And for me, one of the things that's very important is the community does really value the role that teachers, most of whom were young women, played in schooling the children. It's no accident that young women young teachers, women teachers, assume major positions in their communities because they're accorded such respect. They have that kind of social capital. They also, in many cases, independent because they're single. So that her life tells us a lot about how young women like her that were teachers were able to assume leadership positions.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, but it's not some kind of contradictory argument that you are saying, because if the important thing is the woman that is teaching, why at the same time can be the community that is taught, in this case, by the woman? Or by the individual. At the end of the day, I don't care that it's a woman or a man. At the end of the day, if individuals are important for the community, it's not a little bit contradictory what you're saying that at the end the community is going to be.
Well, she reflects and reinforces important values in the community.
This is other thing. This is other thing. This is another argument.
Did you get that?
No, I'm not, I'm sorry, I'm not following you.
Yeah, no. At the end of the day, you are saying that the important is the individual in this case, because it's going to implement certain things in the community. But
Yes.
at the end, you are saying that the community is going to be important, that if they're going,
Well, she's important in herself because of ideas, for example, that she promotes. The rights of women, for example. She was I think some feminist scholars would call her a womanist, but I think she was a feminist. She wrote quite a bit about, in which she addresses women and tells women that they need to rid themselves of the pedestal role, because like kings and gods, you know, these are roles that are given to you and the man can take them away from you. So there's ideas. Her life is important in itself because of the ideas she generates. But I think what I was talking about is how individuals also are important, because they're a window that allow us to see the larger social context that defines who they are. But she's basically reflecting and reinforcing things.
So I want to try, okay, go ahead. Well, I was just going to maybe shift it a little bit and ask, because I was really struck, so I'm taking advantage of my position up here, sorry, by, you know, thinking about our opening talk and then thinking about what Chago was talking about and some of the tensions, right, about who we are, right, about issues of identity and some very different ways of framing that and thinking about that. And I wondered if you two could maybe speak a little bit to each other's talks.
Well, I found Santiago to be very informative. And by the way, we're tocayos. Let me augment this. My legal name is Jimmy, Jimmie. And when I first started school, kindergarten, I went to class like everybody else, and the teacher started going through roll call. I'm getting to a point. Pedro stood up, Maria stood up, and she says, Santiago, and nobody stands up. And then she comes to my row in front of the front person sitting in my row, and she says, Santiago. And I'm thinking to myself, this stupid sucker doesn't know his name. Okay? She walks back to the row in identity, okay? Grabs me by the hair, lifts me out of my chair, okay? It hurt. Don't laugh, it hurt, okay? I started crying, ran out of the classroom, ran 7, 8 blocks home, okay? Walk into the house, my mom is ironing, watching novelas, and she said, "What are you doing here? Why are you crying?" I said, "The teacher pulled my hair." And my mom was very protective of all 7 of her reyes, okay? Her little kings. So she puts on her sweater and she said, "Let's go back to school." "Why did she pull your hair?" She says, my name is Jimmy. And I said, "Huh?" She says, "Wait a minute, hang on." She goes to her box where she has all her birth certificates and confirmation certificates and, all the church documents for each of us. And she goes, she says in Spanish, "Fíjate, tiene razón." You know what? She might be right. And I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, when you were born, the lady asked me what your name was. And I said, it's going to be Santiago Luis." And the lady says, "What's that in English?" My mom says, "I don't know. I think it's like Jimmy." And the lady put down Jimmie, not Y-I-E. Okay? Must have been from the South. But this whole issue of identity, I shortened it to Jim over the years. And I think that like Petra Santa Cruz and her search for identity found it in her husband, I think my success professionally, academically, and societally is due to the fact that my oldest brother is Manuel, my sister's Angela, my next brother was Eugenio, I was Santiago, and I was Santiago until I started school. Everybody in my family, "Santiago, ven aquí." And so, to me, I was Santiago. Abrupt awakening, but that identity thing has, I think, a lot to do with your trappings and how you surround yourself and who you relate to. Has a lot to do with your identity and how quickly you can assimilate or look like you're assimilating. So I think that your point, I have 7 brothers, okay? And they've all dabbled in a variety of substances. And I'm always amazed by the number of Latinos and blacks. New York Police Department, profiling issue comes to mind, is that we're always stopped in terms of we're always suspicious. If I was in Texas, by the way, I wouldn't buy a white pickup truck. But I think that the point is that we have to adapt to the things that we're doing or that we experience. And I think that your survey, your research was, I think, very, very insightful. The one thing that I think we probably need to explore for those of us who are involved in, I follow police shootings, okay? And the number of police shootings a year for young Latinos and blacks, Ferguson is just the most recent example. A few months ago, there was a 13-year-old kid in Northern California who was walking down the side of the road with a BB gun that police said looked like an automatic rifle. They both stopped, drew their guns, told the kid to drop the gun, yelling at him. The kid turned around, and as he turned around, 13 bullets into the 13-year-old kid. So to me, the whole issue is there's a lot more there than meets the eye. And one of the people, or one of the organizations that I am really concerned about is the whole privatization of prisons in this country, who are lobbying police departments and law enforcement to exercise that profiling and stereotyping of our communities and have a tendency to shoot first and then ask questions. And believe me, folks, I have, might be a next book, but I have like, right now, probably 30 to 35 examples in the past 5 to 7 years of unnecessary shootings of unarmed people because they happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And we have no control over where we are in our communities. Identity.
I think, I mean, the point of this is that I wasn't able to articulate today because I was just trying to focus on how drug policy has actually shaped the border in terms of policing and drug trafficking organizations' operations, is that now, right, we look at the border for these offenders, right? And increasingly, they're doing a lot of racial profiling around, like, right, Mexicanness, right? So we're looking for Mexicans, and that's how we sort of wage a war on drugs. Right? If anyone's read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, that's interesting in the sense that, and she says from the very beginning, she's like, you know, this is a critique of the war on drugs. Part of the folks affected are Latinos, but she never really gets into how Latinos are affected. And that book was very powerful in bringing to light the injustices that African Americans have experienced around the war on drugs, but it also achieved another really problematic sort of end game, right? In the sense is that it sort of redirected that attention now to Latinos and Latin Americans, right, and specifically Mexicans, right? So it's able, right, we're able now through this sort of argument and discussion of the injustices of the war on drugs to say, you know, like, there's a lot of African Americans in prison that need to be released. There's a targeting of African Americans. But there isn't that same recognition of how Mexico specifically has been affected, the U.S.-Mexico border, and how we've really seen the deterioration of social life, right? And that becomes significant because that sort of assumed control over all elements of social life, right? So young people now are drawn to that activity, right? There's folks that I talked to along the border when I was doing research, and they said, you know, like, we get stopped all the time, right? People think we're, you know, trafficking in drugs. So what's the incentive to not do this? If at this point we're suffering all of the sort of policing repercussions without any of the monetary gain from it, right? Then what's wrong with not doing that, right? And so I think you know, it's sort of a circular process of how folks start to see themselves as criminalized, and how it really restricts mobility and movement, right? Not just social mobility, but also like actual physical mobility. We talk about folks along the border, right? And we have a lot of students here at Southwestern from towns like Laredo and the Rio Grande Valley. They're here and they have the ability, I was in the same position, to be able to move back and forth quite effectively. But some of our peers down there do not have the same privilege that we do. And they're essentially fixed, right, in their mobility and their ability to not just move up in terms of income, but also, like, they can't even leave, right. The space between Laredo and right, the checkpoint in Coahuillas, or just right in Laredo's case, it's even closer, right? So they can't really move outside of the border region because they're so suspicious looking, right? And they garner so much attention.
It's really interesting. So, okay, Sadie, and then.
Dr. Guerra, I was wondering if you could kind of tease out those gendered and class relations that also, like, happen, I guess, in this trafficking. Well, because when I think of, like, drug smuggler, I think of, like, a poor, young man, Mexican man, basically. And so, but now that we're talking about, like, mobility and, I guess, like, race generalizations and these things that are happening, I'm wondering if, like, are you seeing, like, some of the gendered things that are happening differently where it's, like,
Yeah. I mean, here's the interesting thing about and something that I talk about in like my larger work, but I can't address in 30 minutes, right? All these policy sort of impositions have really affected the makeup of drug trafficking organizations, and all it's done is consolidated power. So now you have really wealthy folks that don't even know how much money they have, like folks like El Chapo, that money's supposed to get to them and it's just getting lost all sorts of places. And along the border, right, I was able to document in the 70s, right, 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were these families that operated these small drug trafficking organizations and were able to, amass, compared to other folks along the border, amass a significant amount of wealth. And that all starts to change as power starts to get consolidated, right? So now you start to see, especially, you have female, GAPAs, right, head of organizations, but then you also have these women have to engage in particularly masculinist behaviors to assume any sort of leadership role under the new system. In the old system, if you were part of the family, you were typically protected from being involved in those activities, right? And that caused a degree of isolation from the business. But gradually, by the late 80s, early 90s, as all these things are in shift, more and more folks want access to that income, and so they have to start to enact different behaviors, right? So, doing the menial work, right? If folks are driving, right? Okay, right now that we're under more police surveillance, women don't seem as suspicious as men, so why don't we take our grandmother with us while we go drop off a load in, Houston, right? Why don't we use our sister to carry a load when we're, going such and such a place, right? So it really alters the way women start to become active in the drug trade, and then it has sort of really dramatic repercussions for their own roles, right?
There's an example, by the way, of how the cartels are corrupting politics in Mexico specifically. There's a woman who was recently found, or is under investigation, for having the cartel people do away with her competitors and with people who she just didn't like, while she's on television doing public service announcements for giving monies to nonprofits and for social agencies. And then Selma Hayek just did a movie a couple years ago, where she was a capo.
This is Savages.
Savages.
Yeah.
And a very good movie because it captured a lot of the essence of how effective, there is no more gender gap in terms of how some things get done, and it's who's the smartest and obviously who's the most ruthless.
Yeah.
And in many instances, you're seeing more and more of that evolve. And it's partnered with politics and elected office and partisan politics. So that, the 43 students who were incinerated, there's talk that was politically motivated as opposed to narcotics motivated, because they were getting in the way, they were hampering the elected officials. And I used to be a TV reporter in San Diego, and I covered a lot of Baja California. And one of the things I used to do, I used to try to go down, and my assignment editor would give me the theme of the story that he wanted. Hey, we got this guy being elected, there's a lot of cronyism, we want you to go down and ask about that. And I said, you're crazy, right? And I did get to the point where I could talk pretty candidly with a lot of people down there. And the one thing that always struck me was a response I got from the governor at the time, Roberto de la Madrid, who was educated in the United States and became the governor of Baja California Norte, or Baja California. And he used to say, Jim, we do the same things that you do in the United States. We do it on top of the table. And there was sort of a candor about that sort of stuck with me, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that, this whole political thing, the cartels, the narcotraficantes, and politicians, I think, are getting more and more in bed, as are, pardon me, in this country, our elected officials getting into bed with lobbyists who represent the other side, the militarization of police, the privatization of prisons. And the whole idea being is that if we can get more people into prisons, we're number one in the world, ladies and gentlemen, for the number of people we have in prison, numerically and percentage-wise, in the entire world. So, I mean, to me, there's a lot of, you start scratching at these issues, the war on drugs. We've concluded that that we've lost the war on drugs. There's no way to get a cap on it. And a lot of it is because somebody is lining somebody's pockets.
Well, Chavo, one of the things that I appreciated about your presentation is that you, aside from other things, you pointed out the personal connection between you and your what you're studying, and all of our connection too with all kinds of things associated with the trade. But and I noticed too that all of us, I think, to one extent or another, presented on our work in a personal way. I think all of us make our work very personal, but I think that was evident among us. And while you were speaking, I had to think that I had a number of thoughts about, as you suggested, we're all on the border, that's where I come from too, are intimately tied to all of this stuff. I have cousins that are border patrolmen and people that are involved in the trade. And I'll tell you this one story. My recently departed dad had Alzheimer's, and we have so many stories about him, but one of the last stories involved this lady who was visiting from San Fernando, the killing fields of Tamaulipas. And she was visiting, and my dad was kind of gone, not really, he was listening. So my mother says, well, how's it going over there? He said, well, it's bad. People getting killed. But they just caught Ocio Cárdenas Guillén. And my dad says, oh, el primo. Ocio Cárdenas Guillén is one of these capos that brought in Los Zetas, and he's now here. He's my second cousin. You believe that?
I'll bring it even closer to when Mel John and that group took me to Matamoros. My last name made me, I should say, it inspired fear amongst the folks living in the colonia, because the founder of the Gulf Cartel, Juan Nepomuceno Guerra, is actually one of the guerras that I'm connected with, and he was like the leader that these folks, they were squatting on some of his land, right? And so when they found out my last name, they were like, yeah, and so yeah, it's strange how we're all sort of linked, right, along the border. And I was talking to students earlier about, right, I named a lot of the stuff that I deal with narcos and narcs because they're sort of mutually constituted, right? You can't have narcos unless you have narcs, right? And you can't have narcs unless you have the narcos, right? Like, they're dependent on each other. And increasingly, all their work is concentrated on the border, right? Like, you don't see their activities in many other places, right? They don't exercise the same kind of control anywhere else as they do, right, in these areas.
So I have a question for Professor Guerra, which I was struck by the way, and I've read about this, but I wanted to hear you talk about it more, the way that traffickers are adopting state tactics, and really, I think they're acting like a state. And so I was wondering, in lieu of Mexican state, I mean, the Mexican state is kind of failing right now, right, with Peña Nieto and his fancy tour to China while, all the civil unrest is happening. And his daughter's saying, we don't want to think about it right now. I was wondering if you could, I mean, she said that to the press. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that narcos are acting like a state. I mean, how are they literally taking the place of the state? And how have you found that in
Yeah.
your work?
Well, and they're also sort of competitive states. So
Yeah.
I talked about how Los Zetas sort of rose to power because of our policies, right? And Los Zetas was sort of taking control of the entire sort of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, right, along Veracruz, all the way up to Tamaulipas, and it's sort of for the kids from Laredo, right? They had control all the way up to just north of Laredo, and then in 2003, Sinaloa started to try to come in, right? Chapo tried to come in and start to assert more control over that territory, right? So the border becomes this important site that folks need to control on the drug trafficking side. And so all this corridor up from Mexico City, up through central Mexico, through Zacatecas, through Durango, through Jalisco, became sort of the competitive battleground. My wife's family, they're from Zacatecas, and so we go down there quite a bit. And at that time, when I was doing my research, that Los Zetas was sort of rising to power, they did a really interesting thing because these two organizations were at battle for the territory in Zacatecas. So they said, you know, the Zetas come in, they push out the military, take control of the town. They say, look, we can provide the same things that the Mexican government can. You pay us a tax, right, el 10%, and we take care of everything. We'll protect you from other groups, we'll protect you from the military, and their sort of bid for mordidas, right? We're just a little more open about it, right? And then the Chapo, they get sick of Los Zetas, so they call in Los Chapos who want that territory. And now the Chapos provide the same sort of thing. They get tired of Los Chapos, they call in the military, and it was this sort of round-robin system in central Mexico where folks, and the communities became sort of really unstable because folks never knew who they were sort of paying tribute to and who was sort of in charge of their territory, right? But there's these sort of competing operations around, right, working like a state. And they did that through tax imposition, providing protection, providing employment, right, all these things. But it sort of morphed into these really sort of dangerous situations as folks compete for territory. But then the Mexican state is also a significant actor in that, right? And then any competing organization.
But, you know, just to push it a little further, and I think this is really interesting, right? In Mexico, but not just in Mexico, in Brazil and in some other places, in some cases, more and more what these cartels are doing is they're improving the roads.
Yeah.
And they're building hospitals, and they're building clinics, and they're building schools, and they're paying teachers, right? And so they are fulfilling the functions that the state is not,
Yeah,
right?
and Dia de los Niños, all along the border, from Piedras Negras as the Zetas were sort of getting more and more territory. They did all these festivals for Dia de los Niños, right? Days honoring teachers, right? All these activities, right, where they were, you know, essentially, and that's why I like to start and end by talking about, right, this isn't a debate about between bad and good guys, right? Because we can, if we look at certain individuals, we can find the good and the bad in both, right? This is a way of thinking about how do we minimize the sort of violent effects, right, of a particular industry that's been made illicit for the purposes of gaining geopolitical control, right, asserting control over particular populations and particular territories, right?
I'm going to let you two professors fight over who gets the last question.
One comment.
Oh, yeah. No, go ahead.
When I grew up in Lima, it was a shining path.
Yeah.
And there you see the connection between the shining path and the narcos. It was really interesting because it was then this collaboration, right, between getting funds and then taking over a big chunks of Peruvian territory, right, and creating a nation within a nation. And this is happening in the 80s.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very interesting history we can talk about you know, Latin American politics that goes through the border down all the way there as to the politicization and drugs, right? And how that creates political phenomena, right? So it's not only an economic phenomenon, but then we're talking about political realities that are not reducible to these countries. And you see what I'm trying to say? But they are the proliferation of states within states. Just a comment because I lived through that.
Yeah, and usually, like when I teach a course, like we start we base the course off of the commodity system, and we start with all the substances in their source countries, right? And talk about, think about the logic that goes into trying to control cocaine production, right? Something that in its sort of natural state is vitally important and central to the cultural practice of the territory where that, plant is native to, right? Just because we don't know how to handle our shit in the Midwest, right, that means we have to completely undo the way of life of a particular community because it's easier for us to do that than to regulate our own consumption, right?
I was going to address that point, is that one of the things we have to be very careful about in discussions like this is to paint our neighbors to the south as, again, being the bad guys and having all the corruption. This is human nature. This is human nature. Take away the political borders, take away the political ideologies, and look at people's behaviors, how they develop organizationally, how they develop politically. And if you look at the motivations of people seeking out power, it's universal. It just manifests itself in different ways. And I really do believe that what one of Mr. De La Madrid's people told me is that the difference is some of us work on top of the table, some of us work under the table. But our motivations and our behaviors are basically the same.
Dr. Johnson, take us home.
Well, of course I'm going to come back to race. I live there. But I kind of want to connect Nicole and Santiago's talks a little and ask you, Santiago, if you thought there were, the way in which color and racialization work within Mexican drug traffickers. You talked about how the white Mexican dichotomy works, but I'd like to hear you talk about any of that sort of stuff that Nicole talked about happening in your research.
Yeah, I mean, that's, right, if we just look at the border and like Mexican drug trafficking, you have all sorts of manifestations of it because, right, if you go back to the 80s, right, in Tijuana, you had these, the Ariano Felix brothers. They were these sort of upper middle class folks that just transitioned from like legitimate business into running a drug trafficking organization. At the same time, a lot of the folks that I did work with, right, sort of tracking in the Rio Grande Valley, the birth of these sort of drug trafficking organizations in their initial phases, a lot of them were farm workers, and that sort of cut across the sort of color spectrum. And this is sort of the interesting thing, right, is that right, that story that I shared about myself and my friend getting detained, we're both really light-skinned Mexicans, right? In fact, the folks that stopped us were, for the most part, darker-skinned Mexicans, right? And this is a component that I didn't get to address, right? But increasingly, the drug war is actually, we export that to fight, right? We see it fought in Mexico between, right? Let's bring in the military. Well, we can't use people from the same place, so if we're going to fight the war on drugs in Mexico, let's bring Mexican military from the south, which are primarily indigenous people, right? From Chiapas, Oaxaca, right? All of these sort of Zapotec people, bring them up to northern Mexico, where phenotypically they're very different Mexicans, right? And let's have them police those folks, right? And so you run into really sort of, it's not very neat to understand who's on what side, right? In the same way that that I sort of colored it right between white and Mexican. That categorization is much easier to manage than internally, like what it means to be a Mexican trafficker or a Mexican law enforcement official, right?
Please join me in thanking these folks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.